Hello, hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Chris's Corner. I'm super excited about today's topic, but before we get into it, please, if you're watching live with us, make sure you put in the comments, whatever platform. What's crazy, some of you don't know this, but IOCF is streaming this live on multiple platforms, including Facebook and YouTube and other channels. So please, wherever you're at, make sure to comment, say hi in the chat, tell us where you're from. Sometimes the guests have friends and family tuning in, so make sure to say hi, and we'll definitely get to that. Besides that, make sure to ask questions. So we have questions for ourselves, but we definitely want to incorporate any of your questions. And today's focus is really going to be on building an inclusive practice for clinicians, but also an inclusive OCD and mental health community to make sure all voices are represented. And so if you have any questions related to that or any comments, please put that in the chat, as well as if you just have general questions. Sometimes we can take a quick little break and ask general OCD based questions because you have experts here. And I know it's hard for a lot of people in different areas of the world to get help and to get support. So we have some really good OCD experts on this live stream as well that you can definitely ask. So thank you for everyone joining in. And once again, make sure you let us know where you're from. We have somebody from Texas. I know, Jelani, you're from Texas, right? It's hot. It's hot. That's all I know about Texas right now. We have Texas and Florida. Y'all hot. We're in California hot. A little cool, but it's hot. So we have Inu TikToker from Texas. So hi, welcome. All right. So make sure throughout the stream you're putting in your questions and where you're from. Quickly, before I introduce my guests, I just want to remind you that this live stream is intended to serve as an educational content, and it's not intended to replace therapy. So for treatment-related questions, please be sure to work with your local provider or contact a local clinician. The International OCD Foundation is not a crisis hotline and should not be used if you are in distress or feel unsafe. If you are in a crisis or you are ever feeling suicidal or unsafe, please go to your local emergency room. You can also call 911 or the suicide prevention hotline at 800-273-8255. Also, we're, like I said, streaming across a lot of different platforms, and we want to create as safe of a space as possible and to be kind and respect to everyone. With that, this is being broadcast on various social media platforms and is being recorded. So please be mindful of that as you ask personal questions or leave comments. At the end of the day, we are all here to support each other. All right, so I'm really, really excited to introduce my guest today. So like I said, the main topic, definitely you can ask general OCD questions, but the main topic today is going to be on how to build a more inclusive practice and a more inclusive OCD community. As you may know, there are different disparities in different marginalized groups for getting care, mental health care in this country. And so we just want to talk about how we can make sure that the needs are met of different groups, all seeking out mental health and OCD treatment. So I'm really excited to have my guests on today. So I'm going to introduce each of them. So my first guest is Marcia Rabinowitz, and they are a licensed psychologist in Miami, specializing in the treatment of OCD and anxiety disorders. Dr. Rabinowitz has graduated with a Bachelor's of Arts in Psychology from the Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, and earned her Master of Science in Mental Health Counseling from the University of Massachusetts, Boston. Dr. Rabinowitz received her Doctor of Clinical Psychology from Spalding University. She completed her clinical internship at the Seven Counties Internship Consortium and her postdoctoral fellowship at McLean Hospital OCDI. After completing her training, Dr. Rabinowitz worked as a staff psychologist at McLean Hospital OCD Institute and was an assistant psychologist at the psychology department at McLean Hospital and an instructor in psychology at Harvard Medical School. In addition, Dr. Rabinowitz served as the clinical director of Rogers Behavioral Health in Miami. Currently, she is dedicating her time and knowledge to her private practice and offers specialized treatment to the diverse Miami community. Dr. Rabinowitz is a member of the IOCDF and is fluent in Spanish and Portuguese. Hello, hello, doctor. It's good to see you.
Hello, thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm very excited.
Yes,
Thank you.
super excited to have you on. My next guest is Jelani Daniel, and he's a doctoral student in a combined clinical and school psychology program at the University of Houston Clear Lake. Previously, he worked as a licensed professional counselor in private practice at Baylor College of Medicine's outpatient OCD program. He has 15 years of experience being involved in the treatment of patients with anxiety, OCD, and related disorders. During that span, he has worked at various OCD clinics, such as the Menninger Clinic and the Houston OCD program. He also serves as a member of the IOCDF's Diversity Advisory Council. Welcome, Jelani.
Thank you. I appreciate being here.
Absolutely. And last but not least, of course, is Tiffany Vacencio. She is a mental health clinician at the Gateway Institute in Orange County, California. I work with her, she's my coworker, and specializes in the treatment of anxiety, OCD, and other related disorders. She has worked with a diverse population of people suffering with OCD, through individual, group, and intensive outpatient treatment. As an Asian American of Taiwanese descent, she has invested in deepening the understanding of mental health issues and evidence-based treatment in the Asian community, as well as expanding the cultural competency of mental health clinicians working with minority populations. Hello, Tiffany. Good to see you.
Hi.
I see you all the time, but good to see you.
Yeah.
Well, welcome everybody. As once again, if you're watching, please make sure to drop questions, say hi. I'm really excited about today's topic. As some of you may know, it is still Pride Month. We have one day left. I identify I'm in the LGBTQ community. And today what we wanted to talk about is OCD in general, but also a little bit about some of the things that we see in marginalized populations and different diverse groups and ways that we can better serve those populations, both here at the IOCDF, OCD in general, and mental health community at large. I think, at least I can say for my community, a lot of times people come in with OCD, but there's also maybe some other things going on, comorbid depression. They might have some family issues that get brought up, and it's important as a clinician to kind of understand and to know sort of what your client is going through. So I'll start with you, Jelani, maybe talking about a little bit just about what you see in the Black community, some of the challenges they might face to find treatment or to get care. Or, I've been to a lot of the different OCD conferences throughout the country, and there's not always your community represented as people attending. And, there's obviously disparities and stuff. So maybe just give us a little overview of some of the things that you've noticed and ways that we can maybe work on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a loaded question. I could talk about that for quite some time. I think one of the main issues, kind of what you were leading up to, is in terms of like access to care is something that can be very difficult, and especially not just. I mean, it could be for multiple reasons. Whether it could be due to whether there's not a lot of treaters that are available within the community. One of the big issues also is like, for a lot of people, not just within the Black and African American community, but for other communities, it's people often would prefer to work with people who look like them or who are of the same culture or background and who can, feel like they can identify with. And, in terms of other treaters, if we're talking specifically about the Black and African American community, there are not that many. I think latest stats that I saw was, less than 4% of psychologists are of the Black and African American community. So, there's not a lot of treaters within this community available for people who are within this community who want to see treaters who are like them. And so that's one, one hindrance. I think. I think also, again, in terms of like, whether it be if like difficulties affording care can be so expensive. I know just in Houston, in terms of all the specialized OCD treaters, I think there was only one who takes insurance. And so that can be very difficult, especially for low income communities. And, not to say that we're not saying all Black people or whatnot are within the low income community, of course, but oftentimes those who are of low income struggle to be able to afford healthcare. So that can be one of the issues. I think there's also, in terms of like attitudes within the Black community regarding healthcare, in terms of like struggles to really trust, how trusting this field and whatnot, especially in the medical field in general, in regard to the histories of how people of color have been treated, really mistreated or neglected and disregarded. And so there are a lot of people who may very well need help, but are apprehensive in reaching out to be able to seek help. So there are a variety of different barriers in regard to Black people being able to access care and getting help, those are just some to start.
Yeah, no, thank you for shining some light on that. I remember a staggering statistic I found in grad school was that only in Los Angeles, less than 1% of psychiatrists are Black. And so, if somebody feels more comfortable working with someone in the same community, I mean, less than 1% of psychiatrists in all of Los Angeles, which is like basically has bigger populations in some states. So I definitely think, representation is key. I'll go to you next, Dr. Rabinowitz. You are in a very diverse community down in Miami. There are so many different like Latinx populations, but also just in general. What are some of the disparities that maybe you see, or what are some of the concerns that you see in your community when you're working with clients with OCD and related disorders?
Mm-hmm. So similar, like access to care, that's a big one, right? Like a big barrier, also financial. Like was said, like Jelani said, like the very little. I think might be, the only OCD clinician in Miami that takes insurance. So that is a big issue for sure. Stigma for this community, like this is huge, especially like for the cultural aspect of some of the Spanish speaking Latinx community. Like they want to keep like problems within the family. They don't want to go and expand that to another professional. There's a little bit of trust for some of the communities too, because again, we have to think about the diversity as people coming from different countries that speak Spanish, but the culture is like so different, and that also involves like their own experiences and how they came to this country too. Like, are they refugees? Are they escaping from, hard times, like economical or violence? Are they here because they want to be here? They're here because they're so there's a lot of factors that we have to account for. But I would say that stigma, financial are the big two.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the big things that a lot of communities deal with. I know in my community, for instance, the LGBTQ community, not only is there stigma, but I'm going to jump to you in a second, Tiffany, but also for us, there's always a fear. Does the clinician, I mean, if you walk in and your clinician looks like you, and predominantly most clinicians are going to be white and straight and cisgendered, that they're going to accept you as a person. But if you're walking in and you're, Latinx or Black or Asian or, queer, and you walk in, you don't know if your clinician necessarily likes you or votes in ways that, put your community down. So I think that's why people feel, because a lot of times people ask me like, why, it's just OCD treatment. Why do you need a clinician that's LGBTQ or Black? What does it even matter? And it's like, I don't know about you guys. I don't want to speak for you guys, but walking in for me, when I used to do therapy, and I, very open about my own OCD story, I never knew if my therapist liked gay people. And it's like, they can say like, oh, it doesn't really bother me, I'm just your therapist. But, if the person has certain views that impact your community, that's always kind of difficult, that trust factor. Before I jump to you, I just want to say hi to some people in the chat. Dave from the Philippines, thank you for joining. I'm going to butcher the name, but
Did we lose Chris?
I think we did.
Yeah. Well, I'm happy to kind of jump in with, I think, the question that he was going around to you guys with, in terms of the Asian community. I think stigma, which you talked about, Dr. Rabinowitz, I think that is a huge part of, a barrier to treatment. I think for a lot of people who are dealing with mental health issues in the Asian community, it's very much like misunderstood, right? Where if there aren't sort of physical outward symptoms, it's not going to be recognized. And then even if there are these sort of physical outward symptoms of like depression or, all the physical symptoms that you might get of depression, anxiety, that sort of thing, a lot of times it'll sort of be categorized as some sort of medical disorder. And so we'll go see a doctor, but, therapy, that's for crazy people. And if you're not crazy, then you shouldn't be going to therapy. So I think, that sort of stigmatization of mental health then becomes a huge barrier. And then for, particularly I'm in the Asian American community, which has its whole other layer of, sort of that connection to, immigrant population for parents or grandparents, but then also growing up in America, sort of acculturated and feeling more American. So maybe as an Asian American, someone might seek mental health treatment, but then their parents disapprove or don't understand or are unwilling to pay for treatment. And so there can be those kind of like stigmatization and not really being able to explain or have part of your community understand what's going on for you.
Yeah, I think one thing I heard from everyone, and thanks for holding it down, Why I don't know what happened. One thing that I heard, I think, from everyone is that there is like stigma and there's different things and that are kind of barriers. Obviously, in a perfect world, somebody, going in for mental health treatment can find somebody that really understands the community and is even part of it. But we know that just doesn't happen a lot of times. So opening the question back up, what are some things that providers can do that aren't in maybe the same community as their client can do to support? And maybe I'll go first to kind of give everyone a second to think. But for instance, in my community, I mean, it's really hard to find an OCD specialist who's in the LGBTQ community that also is in your state. I know I had somebody who reached out to me that was trans and they were trying to find somebody in Colorado. And I reached out to everybody I knew in Colorado that specializes, and they didn't know anybody LGBTQ specifically as a trans clinician. So I know in our community, what we just really want is to know that the person providing the treatment for us is going to respect identities, sexual orientation, gender identity, pronouns, but more than that, just genuinely be okay with the fact that we were born this way and not have predispositions that they come in with. And some clinicians are really great at holding back their personal viewpoints, but that's not always evident, and that's not always how we feel. So I'll go back to you, Jelani, first. Is let's say somebody is working with someone who is in the Black community who also has OCD, but they aren't in that community. What are some things? I know Tiffany was talking a lot about maybe like the older generation of the family not understanding, and there's all these different moving parts. What are some things that a clinician who wants to be more inclusive to all communities can do to support?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. I think one thing, and again, it's not seen in just the Black community. It doesn't just occur within that community, but in others as well, in which OCD is often misdiagnosed and seen as misdiagnosed as a thought disorder or bipolar or something else of the sort. But not just because of like the content of one's obsessions or their compulsions, but oftentimes because there's like a cultural context in which can get misinterpreted, in which if for Black people, especially, stereotypically Black women may be seen as like sexually deviant, and Black men are seen as very aggressive. And so like if a Black man was to express harm obsessions, they might be seen as, oh, this is a part of who you are. This is like, you're an aggressive person. Maybe you want to do this and have this intent, as opposed to seeing it as an obsession and seeing it as something, is ego dystonic and not a part of who they are. Or, the sexual intrusive thought, in terms of relation to a Black woman, and seeing it as like, oh, okay, you're a sexual deviant or something of the sort, as opposed to seeing it again as something not as part of their character. So I think in general, like the tendency to maybe even over pathologize like some behaviors that can be very adaptive. Like for instance, speaking earlier about how bipolar, like, OCD or some other disorders might be misdiagnosed as bipolar, oftentimes in terms of like anger and irritability that one may experience, it doesn't mean that, they deserve a bipolar diagnosis. Or if someone's experiencing some like paranoia, or even if struggling with feeling aggressive, like these may have been like adaptive qualities within one's community that actually help them to be able to get through, like depending on like their environment that they grew up in. And so like these need to be taken into consideration, like these cultural contexts, and like being able to assess a person from this multicultural lens instead of going into it with this like, presumption that, that their experiences are going to be similar to your own as a clinician or whatnot, or that you're comparing them to like the stereotype or whatnot. So I think it's just important to be able to do that sort of assessment from the get-go to really understand the cultural impact, environmental impact that your clients have experienced.
Yeah, you make a really good point, because in general, I feel like OCD is often misdiagnosed. I mean, when people are going, the studies show that people usually, when they are experiencing OCD, the first person they usually go to is like a general doctor. That's just about 60% of the population. And so often we're finding that they're gravely misdiagnosing OCD. It can be ADHD in kids. It can be bipolar. It can be schizophrenia if somebody really doesn't understand the disorder, Tourette's if it's an OCD tic, etc. But you make a good point. It's like if somebody already comes in with these predispositions or these prejudices about a certain group and starts to pin, an already misdiagnosed disorder with even more misdiagnosis, I mean, that can be really, really harmful to an individual. And then it makes them even further negative towards mental health care because of their treatment. Dr. Rabinowitz, how about for you as well? What are some things that, let's say, there's not everybody is going to be able to work with the Latinx and other, diverse populations. They're not going to be the same kind of cultural background as their clients. What are some things people can do if they're wanting to have a more inclusive practice to make sure that they're supportive?
Yeah, I would say like going back to a basic like idea of like understanding, right? Understanding and learning about your client's experience, culture, and kind of like doing a little bit of that little extra work that it's so important for the client to feel kind of that you care, that you are paying attention to their needs, and that you are understanding even though you might not be of a similar culture, right? I think that there is like that like piece that it's basic, but a lot of times we forget about it. But also for this community, like the Spanish speaking, the Latinx community, is this idea of like the giving importance to the family involvement. And I think that a lot of clinicians get, I'm going to call annoyed by the amount of family involvement within this community. And it's part of the culture. I'm not saying every client would like the family, the parents, sometimes the grandparents to be involved in the treatment, but sometimes that is very important to them. And even though I am an adult clinician, that I only work with adults, I invite families in. Like I have parents, I, do family sessions, like directed to the client and to the OCD, because that's a need that we need to be a little bit more open to and not feel like, they need, it's all about the individual client. Sometimes it is, but sometimes we need to be paying more attention to the family and the client's need.
Absolutely. I know Dr. Barbara Van Nappen out of USC does a lot of research on like family accommodation. And, the more that I've been working with OCD for about 11 years. And the more that I work with OCD, I recognize just how important it is to get family involvement. But you're correct. I mean, there's certain cultures where family is much more part of someone's life and is going to be much more part of their care. And if somebody is used to like the very kind of like white kind of like come in and strap your boots and you're by yourself. And that may not be the best thing for your client. And if you don't do research and a little bit of background on the client's culture, you may completely miss a component that could actually be beneficial in their care. Before I get to you, Tiffany, I wanted to shout some more people out. We have Ellery, why is that name so hard for me? From the UK, we have Janella from Eugene, Oregon, and we have Eric, who is from Texas, but is in Paris, France, which sounds like an amazing vacation right now. Tiffany, same question for you. Let's say somebody is in the Asian or Asian American community, they want to get treatment, but can't find a provider in that same community. What are some things that general providers can provide or need to know about the community to make sure that they're absolutely supporting some of the unique needs that your community needs when receiving mental health treatment?
Yeah, I'm just to kind of echo Dr. Rabinowitz again, because she has some really great points. I think that openness to learning about the culture and how it's affecting that client, whether that's a little bit of outside research on your own, but then I think having that like cultural humility to sort of be open and say like, okay, I don't know a lot about, what it's like to be Vietnamese or to be Filipino. Like, can you tell me more about what it's like for you at home, or what expectations are there, or what is your family's understanding of what you're going through, right? And sort of gathering that information directly from the client and having that openness to sort of be like, take a step back and be like, well, I think I know, but let me actually find out. I think that's that little piece early on in the intake really goes a long way, because then you're signaling to your client that, that you have that openness and that there can be this discussion and deeper understanding and, willingness to do that little bit of extra work to really understand them as a person and not just a diagnosis or, we're just going to work from this one lens. And then I think too, in terms of like, family involvement and that sort of thing, which is super, super important in the Asian community as well. But I think it sometimes looks different because of that like language barrier and that sort of thing. And so, taking the time to sort of to figure out like language that you can use that the families will understand. And I've found, generally speaking, that trying to speak or talk about OCD or mental health issues from a sort of more medical lens, that tends to hit home a little bit more because, that sort of matches maybe their understanding a little bit more of, physical ailments and difficulties in just medical problems. And so if you can kind of couch the mental health issue as a medical issue, then that's a good way to kind of bridge that gap or that stigma or lack of understanding about mental health issued.
Yeah, no, that's well said. I mean, I always think it's figuring out in general just how to speak to, like loved ones and kind of educate them on OCD so that they can understand and be a support system. But I have noticed that with any of my clients that are in the Asian, South Asian communities, a lot of times coming from a more medical lens can work. And I think that's what it's important. So what are some things, my next question is kind of like, what are some things, is there any resources or are there any organizations that you guys like that can help? So for instance, I know that there's through all the different LGBTQ, for instance, they're putting out now specific trainings like working with the trans population for the mental health disparities that they're experiencing, or there's different like Trevor Project that does a lot of work for people that are struggling with suicidality. Because what I find in my community is, we know with OCD, the DSM talks about 50% of everyone with OCD at some point is going to experience suicidal ideation, 25% are going to attempt. And then in my community, I mean, the numbers are staggering, just especially at LGBTQ youth, how many more are having suicidal attempts, suicidal thoughts, etc. So I know for my community, that's a big thing that clinicians are going to have to take into account, that there might be a higher level of potential suicidal ideation, etc. So one of the things that I usually refer my clients to is the Trevor Project has some really great tools for LGBTQ youth and LGBTQ in general, of just how to deal and have resources for, if they're having suicidal thoughts, etc., that go beyond just the general suicide hotline, because it's a little bit better. So that's just like one example. Is there any kind of trainings or anything specific that people who want to have a more inclusive practice, I'll kind of open up to anybody who wants to take a stab at this, organizations or different trainings, or just certain things that they should look into if they want to make sure that they can specifically get some resources to help? And I always think a great resource is, it's important to find clinicians of different communities. And sometimes it's going to be, doing a consult with someone and just saying, look, I'm working with a client in this community. I'm really struggling with this family involvement or this belief system. Because sometimes even of faith, I've worked with clients of a faith that's different than mine, and I don't understand the faith and the way that it's impacting the scrupulosity. So reaching out to a pastor or a priest or to a rabbi to kind of understand why they're believing this. And does their church community do the same thing, or is this definitely out of the scope and more scrupulosity OCD? So I just wanted to see if anybody had some opinions on different resources or ways that they could find out more about, helping your community.
Yeah, I think that what you just said, Chris, about like the consultation piece, I think it's like brilliant, right? Because a lot of times it's impossible to know everything and to kind of like it's impossible.
Yeah.
So like reaching out to other clinicians in your community, or like even like outside of your state, and being able to learn a little bit more about it, right? I think that another good thing is like maybe resources, for example, like in Spanish, resources in Portuguese that might help, maybe not the client, but the families, right? Because we see a lot of bilingual families. Well, I see a lot of bilingual families where, the client maybe grew up here or was born here and is fluent in English, but the parents are not. And even like they would appreciate something in their native language that they can like learn more about it, and then we can communicate. So I think that there's like some resources in Spanish. Like I'm very happy that the OCD Foundation, like for the past few years, like had in like within the conference, like resources and lectures in Spanish. So that can be a resource for people. The NAMI, like it's another like great resource, and you can also find in Spanish and I believe in other languages. I'm not sure, don't quote me on that. Tiffany is like nodding, so I'm hoping. But yes, like I think that would be my my addition to your comment.
Absolutely. Yeah, Tiffany, I mean, that's one thing that I know the IOCF has really been trying to do is translate things in different languages. And obviously, I think, Spanish, things are getting more and more translated. I mean, how helpful is it if a clinician provides material or an organization provides material translated in different languages?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think what's been really wonderful about the IOCDF website, and I'm always like referring people to that website, is they do have so many resources that are sort of like general and address a broad range of topics, and they're doing that in different languages as well. So, same with Dr. Rabinowitz, like I work with a lot of bilingual families where, I'm able to do therapy in English, thank goodness, with the clients. But my Mandarin Chinese, I can have a conversation, but it's not to the depth that I'm able to do it in English. And so being able to turn the parents, or, if they're any other language that I really can't speak, like being able to turn them to that resource and say like, okay, like, please read through this. It's in your language. I may not be able to answer all of your questions super thoroughly, but we can try, right? And it gives us just a very basic foundation just to be able to have that conversation and have that understanding of what's going on with, your child or your grandchild or, your friend.
Absolutely. And I do believe it's important too. I notice for parents to understand their child's, for instance, like if I'm working with a client that's, anywhere from their teens to maybe their 30s or 40s, if their parents don't speak English, it's really difficult. So I know even for me, just having resources in different languages can help because, trying it's just really effective. And so obviously, that could be one thing. I know the IOCDF has always made it their mission, but it's hard. It's hard to find everybody to translate. Same question for you, Jelani. Is there, like one thought that I have is I know that I was working with clients during, everything going on with George Floyd at the end of last May. And some of my clients who are Black, really like that kind of took over. I mean, they didn't really want to talk about OCD because they were so impacted by that. And, as a clinician, it's my job to find resources, and that was helpful. But any kind of resources do you think that people could kind of turn to, or organizations that you find are really helpful?
Yeah. So actually, as you mentioned, especially with the Black Lives Matter movement and just a lot of, social justice movements going on recently, I think, there's been an increase in addressing mental health concerns of people of color and other marginalized groups. So I think I'm trying to recall, there's lots of different resources. There are definitely some on Facebook. I think like Black Therapists Rock, I think is at least start off as a Facebook group, and is also, they have a book. There's, I think, therapy for Black men, therapy for Black girls. There's an app that I like called Liberate. That is a meditation app that is designed and like targeted to the Black community. That I think it's really well done app. It's has really good meditations and addresses a variety of different issues, and so that can be very helpful for those who might be interested in trying that out. And I also want to give a shout out to Dr. Monica Williams. Part of the ICEF. She's an incredible researcher and clinician, and does a lot and has great books that discuss all these different issues, from microaggressions and just lots of other cultural and racial issues that come up in the context of OCD and just mental health in general. So check her out. She has a great website, has a lot of resources, and her books are, like I said, great as well. So
I'm going to make a comment on that in a second. I just want to give Chelsea heads up that I'm going to ask Lizzie's question at 9:31 Pacific Standard Time from Facebook, because I think it's a great question on this topic. But going back to Monica Williams, I'm glad that you pointed her research out. I mean, that's a disparity as well, is there is not a lot of OCD research in general. But, when I had to write my thesis, I wanted to incorporate a whole section on diversity in the OCD community. And Monica Williams was pretty much one of the only researchers I found doing any kind of research on not just like for the Black community, but in general for diversity. And I scoured the different, resources that we get as graduate students, and could not find anything on Asian American community, on Latinx, on LGBTQ. Monica was one of the only ones doing research on diversity. And so she was able, in my thesis, I was actually able to incorporate that point only because of her research. So that's a great point you make. It's not only on treatment, it's also on research. And what people forget is things like the, different assessment tools and different treatment modalities are not always inclusive of all different groups when they do the research studies. So that's kind of an important thing too, is making sure that researchers are including different people, so we get different voices in the research, so that it can the results that then go out to us therapists to use to treat our clients is going to be working for all different clients across the board.
Right.
So good point. I really like Lizzie's question. I think it's something, I'll kind of give my opinion at the end about it for my community. But Lizzie asks, how do you actually ask your therapist their beliefs on things that are important to you? It feels so awkward. And I think that's really, I've had clients do it to me, and I think it's powerful. I mean, I want to be open to a client, but I want to get everybody's opinion first. Obviously for Lizzie, like finding a therapist that shares similar values on things that are important, most likely that are going to open up in therapy, is important. So all of you are clinicians. How have maybe clients done it to you that has felt comfortable or has opened a great dialogue? Or how maybe you haven't had that personally, what is some suggestions for Lizzie to do it in a way that can make sure that the care that she receives is definitely in line with her values, that can maybe help her not feel as awkward about it?
I think I'll start off. I think in terms of how to approach it, I think just being able to express what the concern is, or like how it is important to you, Lizzie. I think it'd be very important if you're saying that, if you were to express, like, I would find it be very helpful to feel like I can connect more with my clinician if I knew that our values were aligned to some extent. But then I think at the same time, like coming from the clinician point of view, I think being able to express, even if your values or your beliefs don't align, it doesn't mean that you still can't work well together. So I think being able to express that too is going to be very important, and be able to recognize that for patients is like, just most of the clients I work with are going to be of a different race or a different gender than myself. And so just because we are different doesn't mean that we can't work well together. And the same for, everybody else here and everybody else within this field. But I definitely think that's an important question to be able to ask, because like your own, for the client, your sense of rapport, comfort, and connection and safety, and also just go back to one other point I think we were talking earlier about in relation to just recognizing our own, like, I can't remember how we were talking about it, but I think it's very important for us as clinicians to listen to clients, right? Just to be able to hear them out and hear where they're coming from and hear what's important, and to validate their experiences. Because I think when we don't do that, that can lead to more of this distrust and discomfort, and can lead to disconnection between us and the clients. And so to be able to foster that sense of trust and rapport, we want to do as much as we can by listening and validating.
Yeah, thank you. How about for you, Tiffany? Like, what are some thoughts about Lizzie's question?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I sort of have, after just years of dealing with OCD at this point, I think I've sort of built in, when there are certain topics that we're going to cover, I will already like self-disclose so that I'm already opening up that conversation. So I think on the clinician side, like, I think that is something that my clients appreciate. Like, so for example, if someone is coming in with scrupulosity, I'll disclose, like, I am not Christian, but I've worked with a lot of clients who are. I've studied the Bible. I have a pretty basic understanding of Christianity and the way that it interplays with religious scrupulosity. So, I'm open to exploring with you how it's affecting you. But this way, my background. And so when I'm asking you to do X, Y, and Z, if it doesn't align with your faith, like, let me know, and we can have that discussion. So I think on the clinician side, I think there's definitely room for that self-disclosure, so that clients already feel sort of welcomed into the fold of having that kind of discussion. But then in terms of asking the question, I really like what Jelani said in terms of, just couching it with explaining, like, this is important to me because, this is how it's affecting me. And so I do I want to know, what your thoughts are, or your background in it, or what is your understanding. And hopefully, you are working with a clinician who has that openness to sort of talk that through with you. And also, sometimes those conversations, they're just awkward, but that doesn't mean that you can't have them, or they're not important, or you shouldn't. It's just getting through that discomfort for that conversation in order to kind of open up a better therapy and greater comfort on the other side of it.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point to make, is sometimes awkward doesn't always mean bad. It's just not comfortable. But sometimes those awkward conversations are needed because what's on the other side of that conversation is so important. And I know sometimes with OCD we have, because of the rumination, it's like awkward moments may cause 4 to 5 hours of compulsive rumination, but recognizing like that's important to have. How about for you, Dr. Rabinowitz? What are maybe some thoughts, because that is important, for people like Lizzie walking into a therapist, wanting to make sure that the therapist at least respects some of their values. How do you feel? How has it happened to you, or how do you feel that it can be done well?
Sure. So I will echo some of what was already said. I think it is important to talk about. Sometimes it is awkward, and it's okay that it's awkward. But I would also like, just as a clinician, keep in mind what Jelani said in terms of, well, not because I don't share certain values or a belief system than my client, that doesn't mean that I'm unable to work with my client. And then I would echo Tiffany and what she said. Well, it's more about the openness to like learn and hear what my client is bringing, and be able to kind of like listen to my client, and not just assume that, oh, no, that's not good. And kind of like listen to to my client, and be able to say, okay, like, let me learn more about what you were saying, so I am more aware, and I can like work with you on this issue. Like, as an OCD clinician, sometimes, well, I would say more than sometimes, a lot of times, I just have like that little question behind, my back, just, okay, what is the, intention of this question, right? Like, what is the function of that behavior or that question? Is it like a little bit of reassurance? But I'm always open about that. I don't even like assume that it is related to the OCD, because I think that is another mistake that sometimes us clinicians do. But I'm open about it. I ask, like, tell me a little bit more about that. Why is that so important to you? And does that has anything to do with some of your OCD concerns? If not, let's have like an open conversation about it.
Yeah, what I was going to say with to your question, Lizzie, I mean, I think going into a therapist is just like, kind of like when you go to a job interview. Yes, they are interviewing you, but you're interviewing for the job as well, because this may not be the right job for you. And I think it's important too, if you don't click with a therapist, and it's not like, I think you make a good point, Dr. Rabinowitz. It's like, you want to make sure that it's not OCD reasons that's keeping you from someone. But like, for instance, like I've had, we've had people come to our practice that are like, I have, sexual intrusive thoughts around women. I have to work with a male therapist. It's like that we don't want to accommodate. But to your question, Lizzie, I do think it's important, because I know for me, so two places that it came up for me is, the first one was, with sexual orientation OCD, I think for so long, people kind of deemed it as HOCD or homosexual OCD, not recognizing that members of my community could also have intrusive thoughts. And I know one of the things that I struggled with is I came out later in life, and I knew that I had attraction to men, but then I was very confused, because I'd think a woman was pretty, and then I would go back and forth, and it wasn't the normal, like, trying to figure out, my sexual orientation. It was very OCD related, very compulsive. And then second, I had relationship OCD. And, I know with my therapist, I was kind of changing pronouns, because I had no clue if she was supportive of my community. So I wish Lizzie, I would have just asked her, but luckily she could kind of see, because I would slip up sometimes, when I would say like, I mean, and then finally she just said, look, I'm really supportive of the LGBTQ community. I'm really supportive of your relationship. And I know you may have felt judged in the past. Please know that this space, you won't be judged. I would like you to feel comfortable with me, and what can I do to be more comfortable that you can open up and be more honest about your relationship. And just that conversation, even though I know that she wasn't in the LGBTQ community, knowing that she at least wanted to hear, wanted to care. And I think that's the overwhelming arch that I've heard from everybody in here, is just, making sure that you're open and willing to listen. Yeah, Jelani.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add, I think, to clinicians, especially those in private practice, I think it can also be helpful to be able to indicate that you may be an ally to certain communities, whether you indicate it through, stickers or information that you have, within your office space or on your website, just, on brochures or whatever, just so that it's seen and it's known that, I am an ally of the LGBTQ community, an ally of, other cultures and whatnot. And so that, it's known, instead of it feeling like someone has to ask if it's something that you're wanting others to know and willing to share. So.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I remember, one of the early trainings I went to, it was actually for the Indigenous population. I was just really interested, and I happened to have a client that was Indigenous population during grad school. And I remember that's one of the things that they said is don't be afraid, if you're an ally to a group, to put it on your website, because that person may not be able to find somebody of the same culture in their area. Them knowing that you at least have done some kind of education for yourself, some kind of research, or at least you're open enough to care, that's really important. We only have 9 minutes, which I told you before we started that this is going to go by in a blink of an eye. So I kind of want to make the last question sort of like a open-ended kind of potpourri, whatever you want to end with. I mean, some of my thoughts are, do you have any opinions of how you'd like to see the OCD community going forward to make, sure that different populations are represented? Or is there any kind of final thoughts that you have for people out there in your community that are struggling to find people that look and believe like them? Or what are just some final thoughts on this topic that you want to make sure people leave with? And also my last question too, I know there's 3, so I want to give you guys some options. I know that my program in grad school was very big on making sure to do social justice and support communities. So what are some things outside of just practice that people can go out to and do to make sure that other populations are being supported and represented in OCD and mental health? So I know I asked a trillion questions in one. I just wanted to make sure everybody had some kind of ideas and thoughts that they could give. Maybe I'll start with you, Tiffany. Any just kind of final thoughts on this topic that you want to make sure that both clinicians and people in the community are kind of left with, whether it's, for the Asian community or just different, diverse populations in general?
Yeah. Well, I want to take one step back and echo what Jelani was saying of just, creating that inviting space by using inclusive language on your forms or documents or on your website, that sort of thing. And, having a diversity of resources at the ready already there, so that even before someone's having to ask for it, you can say oh, hey, by the way, don't know if this applies to you, but, what do you think about this? Right. And having that already ready for them, I think does sort of open up that conversation, which, like Lizzie was saying, it's awkward to start with. So why not take on that awkwardness as a clinician first, right? Make it a little easier on your clients. And then, I think that there are a lot of different resources out there. I love the ones that Jelani and Dr. Rabinowitz were mentioning about the populations that they work with, and might, ask to have you guys repeat those so I could write them down to offer them as well. But I think in the Asian American community, there's Subtle Asian Mental Health on Instagram. There's the Asian American Mental Health. No, the Asian Mental Health Collective is another one that offers different resources like free mental health groups, with the Stop Asian Hate movement and that sort of thing, where, people were people in the Asian American community and Asian community in the US were being really affected by that and are being really affected by that, there were a lot of resources popping up for sort of accessing mental health care, peer support groups, that sort of thing. So those are really great things to kind of look into if you're looking for more support.
You know, I'm glad you brought that up, Tiffany. A real quick note that you just made me think of. You know, I have clients that are in the Asian community, Asian American community, and I know obviously with everything that was going on with the Asian hate and everything was really affecting them. And I think that's why it's also important for us as a community, as clinicians, mental health providers, is to be up to date on what's going on, because you're going to have your clients come in and they're not always going to be robotic and only want to talk about OCD. They may come in and you might be the only therapist they're seeing. And if they're too kind of caught up because of everything going around in their real life, they might be half paying attention to what exposures you're doing, because, you know, they just had a friend that was attacked. I mean, I had a client who had a friend that was attacked for being Asian and in their community. And it was one of those things where I could tell she was distracted. So I finally just asked, like, what's going on? And she finally opened up. I'm like, let's go there. We can always, you know, the treatment. We'll touch on that at the end. So great point. I mean, be up to date on what's going on in general. How for you, Jelani? Any kind of like final thoughts that you want to leave everybody with?
I think especially when it comes to us as clinicians, I think being able to do like a self-evaluation and be able to assess ourselves and being mindful of any biases that we possess, because we all possess them, we all have them. You know, I think that's going to be very important, so that we're not coming across, you know, which is what Tiffany was mentioning earlier about like cultural humility. So we're not coming across as this like expert and like we know it all, whatnot. Being able to, you know, be humble and being able to realize that, you know, we are not perfect. We have our faults, but that we're also willing and open, like being open, as was also mentioned earlier, being open to learn, open to listen, and open, you know, to hearing the person out and seeing what their experiences are, and not coming in with these preconceived notions and, you know, misconceptions about the person.
Yeah, I think that's great as well. And that's the work that we have to do as clinicians. That's why I love that there's continuing education. Like there's different things out there that can help us become better clinicians. And there's going to be the biases we all come in, and there's going to be populations we've never worked with. And if we don't consistently work on ourselves as clinicians to understand that, we're not doing the best service to our clients. So really good point. And then obviously for you, Dr. Rabinowitz, maybe any kind of final thoughts that you'd like to share?
Yeah, well, I agree with Jelani. Like, I think it's so important for us to be always assessing and reassessing ourselves, but also be open to learning and getting out of our comfort zone, and not see ourselves as we know it all, because our clients know them better than anybody else, and they know their own experiences. And if we come across as, hey, you know, I'm this expert who is here to do this for you, this is it. Like that you're missing out on a lot of that collaboration that you need in this field, right? So I think that my last things that I would just say is just kind of like be aware of your community, be aware of like what's going on, like in terms of like stigma or racism or injustice that are happening, and kind of be open if your client wants to address that. Like Chris was saying, like if they're bringing to you that maybe it's not related to your, you know, treatment specific, but it's something they are bringing to you, take the time and listen and understand more, and be open to incorporating, like I said, maybe other family members or that will be important for your client too.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, Jelani, of course.
I just want to make one last point, and I think also just going along with, you know, with OCD, and we utilize, you know, exposure therapy. Like I think we could take like a page from our own book and being able to put ourselves in uncomfortable situations to do exposures, in a sense of like learning how, like about other cultures by putting ourselves in those those situations where we can learn directly from others, not just in like the therapy setting, but like outside, going into these different communities. So even if it's uncomfortable, let's do that exposure for ourselves so we can better ourselves and better our work with our clients.
Absolutely. We ask them to be uncomfortable. We got to be uncomfortable ourselves to get it. I went through OCD treatment for my own OCD. So I remember being uncomfortable, but now as a clinician, we got to be uncomfortable again. That's the only way with growth. I think the final point I just want to make for the LGBTQ community, I think it's so important, as both clinicians and people with OCD, of course, if you want, but, I think some people are going to go through their whole career as therapists, kind of only doing their lane. But I think there are so many different organizations and things for different communities that we can be a part of. And I know my grad program was really big on getting out there and supporting marginalized communities. And I think one thing, my last point I want to make, that I really appreciate that the IOCDF is doing. I know, Jelani, you're part of the Diversity Council. We just started an LGBTQ special interest group at the IOCDF. We're putting out a PSA. Did a Pride, a bunch of blogs for that. I think it's so important. I know for me, I want to hear voices of different communities. I want to hear. That's why I'm so excited to have all three of you on. Like, you all three educated me further today. Just like I hope there was a little bit of LGBTQ nuggets that I dropped in your hats. But it's so important to have different voices at the table, because it allows us to make sure everybody is accounted for and supported, not only in the OCD communities, but the mental health community as general. So I can't believe an hour went by. Reverse time. Just kidding. It's only 9. Let's go again. Another hour. Just kidding. I want to, of course, thank all three of you. Amazing guests. Absolutely great panel. I know it's a good panel when I look up and the hour's gone by in 4 minutes, but thank you so much, everybody, for being here today and just kind of opening up and talking about this topic. I think it's so important and there's so much work to be done. Thank you so much. I know there was a lot of, Ellery, thank you so much. Gay woman with OCD. This was interesting. Thank you. That's why we wanted to do this, to make sure your voice was heard. Thank you, everybody in the comments to ask questions. I know we didn't get to all of them. So if we didn't get to your question, please go to iocdf.org/peace of mind to submit more questions. We'll make sure to get them in future live streams. You can also see the upcoming live stream schedule and submit questions there. Obviously, if you need any kind of resources, make sure to go to iocdf.org, where you can find general OCD resources. Shout out to the affiliates. Make sure, if you can, OCD Southern California, we are having our virtual conference open to anyone, anywhere on July 31st. So if you go to the IOCDF's calendar, when you go to their resources, you will find on July 31st, you'll find out more information about OCD SoCal's conference. Thank you so much to my incredible guests. Thank you to everybody from all over the world that joined us today. Make sure to check out the future live streams, and we'll be back in 2 weeks for Chris's Corner. Thank you, and bye, everybody. Take care.